Thank you so much for everyone for joining. We're going to be talking today with Tim and Dave around back to work and what that means for you, for your clients, and for your workers. I feel like it's a topic that has come up a lot in recent weeks. It's obviously been an extremely challenging year. Nobody really expected 2020 to go the way it has, and I think especially for staffing agencies, it's been particularly hard to navigate because you have multiple parties involved in it. So we're going to be focusing on that as well today and giving some guidelines specific to staffing agencies. I think obviously we've kind of just got over getting people out of the workplace and working remotely, and what does that mean? And now the gears have really shifted and we're starting to think about going back into the workplace and what does that mean? So I think we've had some huge players in the space making some very bold statements, like Facebook have announced that 50% of their employees are going to be fully remote. We have Twitter saying that people are going to be given the options to continue to work from home forever. But I think for all organizations, that's really not going to be the case. And we have to start to think about what does going back to the workplace look like. So just to introduce myself, my name is Catriona and I work for PGC. We are an employer of record in the US and Canada, and we work with staffing agencies and companies to employ their workers compliantly. And then I'm also joined by Tim and Dave from Beeker Legal. So I'll allow them the opportunities to introduce themselves.
Hi, this is Tim. This is the new normal, and we'll talk a lot about this as we go along today. And since everyone's more than 6 feet apart, I can take that off. Beeker Legal, we are a firm that has a very professional and expansive practice in the staffing industry. We have at least 8 lawyers that spend a majority of their time in the staffing industry. And I co-chair that department along with Marty Barasco and Dave Sprong, and I work very closely together with staffing companies across the country on issues from operational issues to high-end mergers and acquisitions and so on. With COVID coming in, this has been a very, very big area for us to talk to staffing companies and how it relates to their end user clients as well. And I'll let Dave give a little bit more background about what he does.
Thanks, Tim. Again, David Sprong, a partner with Beeker LLC. We have offices in New York and New Jersey, in Philadelphia, and in Orange County, California. I'm a long-term employment lawyer, long time, but the last 3 months has just exploded in terms of the issues that are presented for employers, and both employers and employees, both at the federal and at the state, local, and county level. So I've also been involved in the staffing industry for about a decade. I've served on the board of the New Jersey Staffing Association. I speak regularly at staffing industry events. So we're going to try to give you a little bit of both, a little bit of the basics of what employment laws look like, both in terms of remote work and in terms of telework, and also in terms of how those things apply specifically to the staffing industry. So Tim, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, if I might, as a general overview, and like most things in the law, we have the series of complying with not only federal laws and guidelines, but you have state and local guidelines. And it's particularly acute in the COVID environment that we're dealing with. It is a very fluid situation, and these guidelines change on all these levels. So it's one of the things that we're going to be talking about today is kind of a generality. And if you have specific questions about various municipalities or states, we could address those either directly if we can today or offline. But we're going to try to keep it as broad as possible, with the caveat that you can't ignore the fact that it's very complicated. Different states are doing this by governors, executive orders. You have different municipalities, especially with large municipalities in New York and in California and whatnot, that have their own guidelines that go with it. So with that said, we're going to kind of focus on top down. The EOC, OSHA, and CDC all have guidelines. EOC is probably the one that's most relevant in this context because it's giving employment information, information out to employers on how to handle their employees. The EOC guidelines are, driven by OSHA's guidelines and by the CDC as well. And they're so fluid. As an example, and we'll talk about this later, the testing guidelines just came out from the EOC yesterday. So this is the type of thing that it's not I'm going to do this and we're good. It's something that has to be continually monitored and adjusted and adapted with the change in the guidelines.
And Tim, I just wanted to interject something that Catriona referred to. Not only is there fluidity in the regulations and in the government requirements, but also there's a lot of fluidity in what's happening in the marketplace. And Catriona very rightly said that both Twitter and Facebook have yesterday said that people might be working remotely forever. Today, they actually came out and said, well, maybe not so fast. Like, don't go and buy houses yet. Maybe we're only looking through the end of the year. So everyone is sort of learning as they go, and it's hard to make long-term decisions in this environment. We're going to try to help you with that. So Catriona, if you want to start us off.
Yeah, I think it's funny. I think all these companies are trying to be the leaders and the innovators, and then they take like one step forward and two steps back. And I think at this time, like, everyone should be very cautious. This is uncharted territory. You have no mistakes to learn from. Like, everyone is just trying to figure this out. So just as well, one thing I did forget to add is there's a Q&A box at the bottom. So if you have any questions that you would like us to address, please put them in there. If we can, we will address them as we're going through, or if it's very specific, it might be something that we leave to the end or we pick up directly. So yeah, as you mentioned, Tim, like, obviously things are very different state by state. Is there any sort of specific considerations that people should consider around OSHA and CDC guidelines, or by state or city? And I know that's a very broad question, but
well, I think, as we were saying before, you have to start with probably the most conservative guidelines and work back. I think that's pretty common sense, that if you're complying with the most conservative, then you're covering all the others. But what it seems to be, in my experience and with our clients that we've been advising, that CDC, OSHA, and EOC are leading the way. And the states, to the extent that they're doing something different, it may be in the way they're implementing what's being put out by them. Or I'll put it this way. None of the states that I've seen come out with guidelines that are different than the CDC's. They're using those as a starting point and working from those. So I think it's very important, as we stress, that these change almost daily. And the guidance that is coming out is piecemeal. And it's something that, especially HR managers have to literally be looking at, as you pointed out before. The big leaders in the industry are taking one step forward and two steps back, and there hasn't been a lot of testing. And what we'll point out too, not to make it more onerous than it need to be, that there are plaintiffs' lawyers out there that are waiting for people to misstep on these things. It's as we like to say, a guaranteed payday for plaintiffs' lawyers, because when there's new guidelines to be followed, there will be mistakes made, and they are waiting for that to happen. So not to make that too onerous, but from a business point of view, it's something to consider why these are some guidelines that you should follow very carefully and try to reasonably follow them as best you can.
And just let me interject one more thing. Certainly there was a soup that was hard enough to follow when this first started. You had governors issuing stay-at-home and essential business orders. You had the federal government issuing PPP loans and additional guidance for family and medical leave and for paid sick leave that we'll talk about later. But now in the soup, you would have not only the threat of litigation, you have not only employees that are adjusting to the new normal, you have not only politics, and you have not only business realities all into this mix now that are causing this to change every day. So when Facebook makes those decisions and Twitter makes those decisions and backs off on the next day, there's a lot that goes into the decisions to both implement and to sort of step back a little and reevaluate.
Yeah, that's really good. I think as well, like, that's really good guidance too, that the CDC really, like, the variations is how you implement it. So it's good to be able to, like, look to the CDC as that source of information and take guidance from there. And I think as well, like, you have to be mindful of the fact that, not everybody is back to work. There is these conversations about going back into the workplace. Some states are still under stay-at-home orders. So be very cautious too that you're looking at what phase is your state in and how that actually applies to your business. And then once you're comfortable with that, that's when you can really start to look at the CDC guidelines and how that applies. Obviously as well, like, as we talked about, some companies are saying that they're going to continue to be remote. Are workers going to be able to continue to work remotely? What does that mean whenever it is back to work, and how can companies sort of navigate that?
If I might, thank you, Catriona. They're two separate subjects, but they're actually intertwined. That remote working, as we talk with Facebook and others, it is a sea change in the standard workplace. So we're trying to arrive at a new normal. And there's data out there to show that companies were thinking about remote working before this with COVID as early as, or as long ago in COVID time, as the end of March, that there was data showing that 74% of executives that were asked said that 5% at the time, 5% of their in-office jobs were going to be permanently moved to outside the office. And we'll wait to see the data, but since then, I'm sure that number has gone up. You can see that, the industry leaders are going that way. So we can expect that that's the way it's going to go. But what's really interesting too, is when you talk about the different work at home or work remotely, and this is a larger issue too, and we'll talk about it as we go along. It depends on your industry sector as well. It depends on what type of job you're talking about, white collar, if you're healthcare, if you're in manufacturing, all these things are slightly different. One of the things that we find with our clients, and the data shows it, is of the companies that have been polled in the data that say that they allow remote work or telework prior to the COVID shutdown and stay-at-home orders, there's of the 78 that said we allow that, only 20% had formal work policies for remote working and teleworking. And that's something that we stress with our clients. And it's important now with back to work, when people are going back to work, it's like, how many people get to stay remote? And if they are staying remote, what rules govern? And we'll get to why that's important in the staffing industry as well. But it's something that we're looking at with the clients, very intently, that they need to have formal written policies, that they need to explain why they're doing it, and so on, and how they communicate it, either remotely or post it. And in the staffing industry, share it with your end clients, because if you're placing temporary workers with a customer, what's their remote work policy, and you want to make sure that yours match up. So it's a problem. It's going to keep going. And it's something that these policies have to be, fairly thorough and effective. And you have to work through, who's eligible to be working remotely and stay at home, because it's not lost on us as you reopen the workplace. There are people like, no, I prefer to stay home. I like it better here, or I don't want to come in. And so it's very vital that your policies talk about who's eligible to stay, what job descriptions are subject to staying at home and not, and important from the legal point of view, that the distinctions of the jobs that can stay remote and not stay remote has to be done on a non-discriminatory basis. You still have to apply all the laws that work, all the human resource laws that apply to job policies. So it's really important that that the eligibility is clear, that you go back in a written policy, that you make sure your job descriptions describe whether it's one that's eligible for remote working and ones that aren't. Because remember, we do have plaintiffs' lawyers out there waiting for you to slip up. So it's important to do that. And then the guts of those policies really kind of overlay what you would expect in the workplace, except it's extenuated in these circumstances, like timekeeping. Sounds easy. When you're in an office 9 to 5, you keep your time. Now time is immaterial. It seems, I joke with people that they ask me what time of day it is. I say, well, it's daytime or nighttime because the sun's out or it isn't. It's something that you have to install a discipline to make sure your employees are keeping their time, know when they should be doing work and when they're not. So if they're on a mandatory work break or lunch break, that they shouldn't be answering emails or taking phone calls, or that you should be logging when they are and they aren't. And it's very important that we tell our clients about overtime and such for people, that's something that's in the written policy as well. So yeah, all of those requirements. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I just had one thing, anecdotally, we at our firm have implemented a, policy prohibiting overtime without pre-authorization because our staff are so good and they want to help our attorneys who now are working at all hours of the day and night, literally, 3 hours before start time and 5 hours after end time, or traditional end times if there are any anymore, and also on the weekends. And so our staff is eager to help, but they have different concerns for timekeeping, record keeping, and especially overtime that everyone needs to pay attention to. So our best practice on this is document and communicate, right? That's the best way you can handle it. And really, that's not anything new. That's what you should do, or as always should have done in an HR context. And now it's just a little harder to do because people aren't in front of you every day.
Yeah, I think that's such a valid point, because as well, the lines between home and work are so blurred. So you could be online at home sporadically doing little things, answering while still being at home doing things at home. So, having a clear policy on what is contributing to work, what is overtime, is going to be something that's probably really difficult for companies to navigate and manage.
Absolutely, yeah. It's difficult because we did it to scramble to get it done there literally in a week or less in middle of March, right? Yeah. And just because it's working, and just because it's, as Tim said, the new normal, doesn't mean we don't need to reflect and go back and document it. And certainly your policy should reflect what you're doing for real and what your workplace now looks like. And you should be using what you've learned in your policies, but you also have to look at what the guidelines are and adjust your present practices if they need to be adjusted. Just because you started doing it in a pinch in mid-March doesn't mean that you need to keep doing it that way. Adjustment is always good.
Well, and to that point, what we're finding in application is some interesting wrinkles. Like if you're asking people to work remotely, some states require you to reimburse them for upgraded expenses. So I have clients that have people working remotely, and the remote worker has a modem that has X speed, which is not fast enough. And so it's an additional expense for them to upgrade and be able to work effectively. And in some states, and this is important, to be very mindful, as we said in the beginning, about different regulations under each state. Some states require you to reimburse that as an employer. Some don't. So if you have employees in multiple states, you may have multiple treatment, and that has to be documented in your policies. The other one that's kind of counterintuitive is safety. Like people are working in their home, and they may have their family members and others around, and they have to maintain a safe workspace because if someone is injured while they're working, maybe a workers' comp claim, and subject to workers' comp policies and such. So we recommend that there's a checklist that people use, give their employees working remotely to maintain a safe working environment and maintain what we'll talk about later, social distancing. Don't have people in your home, don't have meetings there, and so on. So it's again, we'll talk about in return to the workplace, but it also is important with respect to what happens in the home workspace as well. And as Dave said, you have to communicate and adjust, because one of the other issues that comes up is security. So people are working from home. How much as an employer can you require them to upgrade their security? No public Wi-Fi, encryption, dual login, dual layer protections, and all that kind of stuff. And again, that ramps into, who absorbs those costs, and how do you monitor whether that's actually going on? The other issue, to circle back to timekeeping, is privacy. As an employer, you can monitor how people are using their system, and are they using it for work? Are they not using it for work? How does that match up with timekeeping? So it's very, very important to do. As we see, as these implement, they have real world implications. And to Dave's point, that you have to keep upgrading them and addressing some of these issues that people didn't address in the 1 week we all did it in March. Everybody was told to stay at home.
Yeah, I think that's very valid. I think we all kind of thought this would be 2 weeks working from home and put in policies, and now it's more thinking about the longevity of that in the real world application. And one thing you mentioned, obviously, that we are looking to speak about is obviously the return to the workplace. So yes, this is something that is of a huge concern to employers and employees about their safety and their welfare. What sort of steps can an organization take to make a workplace safe for employees that are going to begin to return?
Okay, thank you, Catriona. The return to the workplace is, again, from what we said at the top, driven by guidelines, but how they're applied is generally driven by industry sector. So as we were saying, if you're in the healthcare and you're going into a healthcare space, a hospital or a care providing space, they're going to be different than a manufacturing space versus a white collar office space. But as generally speaking, there's several that are applicable to all of them, and then from there, how they get specialized for the different industry sectors. But one of the things that most of them look at is limiting non-essential visitors. So yes, you have your employees returning to work, but you also have a policy of who can come and visit, what kind of meetings you can have, the number of people that can attend them. State by state, it's like, is it 6 people? Is it 5 people? Is it 10 people? Is it 25 people can meet? Limit worksite meetings and work groups. Again, we said, go by your state and local rules on whether you can do that, 10, 20, 25, 5. Of course, the now infamous keep 6 feet apart from one another, and all the interesting graphic ways that we've all learned to do that, whether it's in a grocery shopping or other places. That seems to be obviously the standard that's come from the CDC that everybody uses. What that means in the workplace, depending on your setup, is it practical to do that? Do you close every other desk? If you're in a big bullpen type system, if people have their own offices, that's a little bit easier, but it's maintain 6 feet distance, stagger start and stop times of work. So limit the number of people in the office so that they're coming in at different times. If it's practical, that's really one of the things that you want to try to do. If it is, stagger lunch breaks and work and break times, limit the number of individuals entering and leaving the work site concurrently. It's common sense to try to have as few people that you need there. Restrict access to common areas, and that's one, restrooms, break rooms, and so on. Here's the one that everybody talks about: face coverings. Do they have to wear them? And best practices, like, everyone should wear them, and that's the most conservative way of looking at it. Now, there's a couple of wrinkles on that. Not everybody has to wear them if they have a medical condition that prohibits use of a face mask, and whether that's your employees or visitors and how and what they should use the face mask for. And it's also dependent on the industry sector. There are some jurisdictions, like you don't have to wear a face mask if you're 6 feet apart. If you're outside, if you're inside. So you really have to look at the different state laws and whether you have to wear gloves on the premises. Again, consult your local and state best practices, provide personal protective equipment for people. I think that's what we've been talking to our clients about. Instead of trying to figure out whether you should or shouldn't, it's easier just to say, if you can, do. And that way it's not a problem. Also, you take a very firm view that people that want to come into the workspace, visitors that don't want to wear masks or gloves or comply with social distancing, that you can stop them from coming in, and make it very clear that, signage that says if you're not going to comply, that you're not going to come in. Then there's some other things, disinfect, talk to people about how you wash your hands, coughing, sneezing, etiquette, all that type of stuff. Limit sharing of equipment, so everybody use your own laptop or computer, don't share. Provide sanitation materials. Disinfectant, sanitizing wipes, and then require frequent guidelines for cleaning common areas. So that's what you can do to prep the workplace and set some general guidelines that I think apply to everybody.
Tim, I just wanted to add, those are all great. And if you really wanted to do a little homework, all of these return to work issues have been addressed by essential businesses, right? As Tim said, healthcare, maybe if you're in trucking and transportation or other manufacturing, a lot of businesses have been doing this. And so it may be helpful to look on their industry websites. It may be helpful to partner with a business that's been open through this to see what works and what doesn't work in terms of the return to work. Because a lot of white collar businesses are not returning to work and haven't returned to work. And once they do, it's all going to be new to them. So you may not need to reinvent the wheel. Also, I think not only do you have to consider those things that you have to do once the people come back, but then you have to also consider on a broad policy level, is who's going to come back. And there's lots of considerations. You don't want to discriminate against a certain class of people who are forced to come back to work. Even if your business necessity may dictate it, it's going to be a problem. You need to think about your culture. I know a very large company that already started returning people to work in the Northeast, and they started with the CEO, and they've done it week by week from top down. And even though those people are literally going into their offices, closing the door and doing FaceTime or Zoom with other people in other offices on the same floor, they're at least creating a culture that is a return to work culture. So there needs to be, this is not, again, one size fits all. Everybody needs to consider the realities of their workplace, but also the optics and the culture they want to create.
Well, and if I might add to that before we move on to some of the particulars, one of the very interesting, I guess, social science question that revolves around this is why return people to work? And we've been talking to clients, and anecdotally, they're seeing, productivity, if not match in-office productivity, maybe exceed what was in-office productivity before this pandemic forced us all to scatter and shelter in place. So you have this tension with our clients that some are having people come back to work because it's their culture, or they may be driven by real estate needs or what it might be driving it from an economic point of view. But from a KPI and measuring productivity, it seems like most people are finding the productivity is up with remote working. Don't know if that's just because it's being driven by a short-term the pandemic and people functioning because of that, or if this is going to be a long-term trend. But right now, it seems to be kind of part of the decision-making process on who returns and why. And so productivity is another issue that seems to be interwoven into this.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I feel like, I don't know about anyone else, I feel like that's an overwhelming list of guidelines. Like, it's a lot for organizations to think about. And I think as well, like, you can implement these things and you can put these measures in place, but at the end of the day, we're dealing with humans and we're dealing with people. And at what point do you actually ensure that people are following these guidelines? Like, is there a right or wrong way to implement this? Like, what does that mean practically for organizations? How much of this can you actually enforce versus how much is guidelines?
I'll take the guideline part, and then I'll let Dave talk about the enforcement in particulars. Just like with remote working, you need a written policy. You need to communicate. It's the same rubric that we were discussing before, that you have to, one, have a policy, formal, not anecdotal. Be willing to communicate that in all means possible, formal handbook, emails, newsletters, however your organization communicates these things. Communicate it regularly and update them. Because we can see, to your point, Catriona, this is a staggering list of things. Whether as we go forward, those change, some are taken away, some are added to, we don't know. And as we sit here today, whether there's a second wave of COVID that we worry about in the fall that people are predicting or saying that won't happen, will it change these guidelines? Will we go back to sheltering in place? We don't know. So preparing the workplace, you have to adopt policies. That's the best practice. Communicate them. For staffing, it's the same way. As we discussed before, that you got to talk to your end user customers and say, here's our policies. We're going to be sending, as employee of record, we're sending employees to you. What are your policies? They should be at least as stringent as ours, so that the risk is mitigated. So that is not any different than David said before, prior to the pandemic, but is particularly important now because it's a changing situation. HR rules and regulations were more glacial before the pandemic compared to now, that they change daily. These things are that we've said earlier that HR managers need to stay on top of, because they're going to keep changing. So it has to be more of a fluid policy that each time you change, you got to communicate it and make sure people completely understand it. With that, I'll turn it over to Dave to talk about some of the particulars of enforcing these.
And overwhelming is a great word for it, because it really is. I like to say that going, to the doctor is much harder than it used to be. Going to the supermarket is much harder than it used to be. And so returning to work is going to be much harder than it used to be, at least for a short period of time, until we all get used to all of the new requirements that are in place. This is a requirement for the workplace now. And you can see even in the news when people don't comply, what kind of a fervor that creates. But here you could potentially be creating liability. So if you do have employees that are not anxious to comply, you need to deal with it the same way you would in any HR circumstance prior to the pandemic, and that is through communication, education, training, and essentially discipline, right? There needs to be discipline. If people are consistently coming to work without masks, then you're going to need to implement some level of, friendly discipline if people are refusing to comply, because I think everyone needs to kind of come along for the ride. And the best way to do that is to communicate and train and educate.
Perfect. And then obviously there's been talks of like testing, temperature testing and guidelines. Is there any sort of limits as to what an employer can do? Like at what point are you kind of overstepping? Like what are the limits?
This is changing. It's a great question. This is changing sort of every day. But before the pandemic, because of the Americans with Disabilities Act and because of HIPAA and other privacy concerns, you really couldn't ask people about whether they were sick or not. Once the pandemic hit, with regard to COVID, there was a very large relaxing or lessening of those restrictions, and employers were pretty much allowed to ask anything they wanted about whether one of their employees has COVID or symptoms, one of their employees' family members or living partners has COVID or symptoms. And so there was a very broad guidelines established by the EEOC to allow for companies to ask about medical conditions that related to the pandemic that would have been off limits. So sure, I mean, when people return to work, one of the things that a lot of retail businesses are doing are requiring temperature taking before coming in the office. This brings me back to my days as a 12-year-old when I would rub my forehead to try to show that I had, fever symptoms and I wouldn't have to go to school, right? So we're really down to that. And actually, I've talked to people who are worried about walking a distance from the parking lot and getting a little overheated during the summer and showing a temperature when they get to the entrance of the building to be tested. So I think taking temperatures is a very important thing to do, because it's almost up there with face masks and social distancing now in terms of the things that are now considered to be basic level requirements. And I don't see that there's any downside to taking temperatures. There is some discussion that I think just came out yesterday. Back in May, the EEOC said that it was okay to ask employees to get tests in order to be able to return to work if they showed symptoms or if they had a diagnosis of COVID, which, as we know, probably doesn't last more than 14 days. Well, I guess we don't know what we don't know, but that's sort of what the CDC says is 14 days is the quarantine period. You can ask them to get what I'll call an active test to return to work. But yesterday, literally yesterday, or maybe it was the day before, the EEOC came out and said you cannot require antibody testing for a return to work. So there is even a split in that, in the efficacy of that testing and in the importance of that testing, because now the EEOC says you can require your employees to take what I'll call active tests, but you're not allowed to require antibody tests as a prerequisite for return to work.
And if I might, like with temperature, taking someone's temperature, right? If they have a fever and that's all you know, and you say you can't come in. Now, does your remote policy allow them to go home and work remotely?
Yeah.
And that shows you how they kind of tie together. You don't have a positive diagnosis that they have COVID and they're ill. They just have an elevated temperature. They took a light jog across a parking lot in July. They didn't feel like working in the office because they don't want to be in the office. So they have a fever, they go home. Now, are they required to work remotely or not?
And that's a great point, because that's where politics and business realities come in. Because at the beginning of the pandemic, especially here in the Northeast, we were all ready to say, okay, you're sick, stay home. But now, are we ready to say automatically if you have a cough or a fever that you should stay home and stay home for 14 days? I don't know if the realities are such that business is going to be able to sustain that going forward. And so we may need to do a little bit more digging into what kinds of symptoms, and we may need to require our people to try to get testing so that we know sooner rather than later whether they are in fact infected and whether they can then return to work.
Yeah, it's really good points. And one thing that kind of struck me during that was when we talk about like CDC and the guidelines, it talks about your employees. And obviously, a lot of people in this call are staffing agencies. And I think that adds like an additional level of complexity. What sort of like would be the unique things for staffing agencies to consider? Because obviously there are multiple parties involved in these conversations.
Yeah, certainly if the return to work is going to be 10 times harder, the return to work for staffing companies is going to be 20 times harder, right? Because not only do we have our workplaces to worry about, but we also have our clients' workplaces to worry about, and our clients' policies, and our clients' employees potentially exposing our employees unnecessarily. So what's happening if our employees at a client side are complying with all the back to work guidelines, but a client's employees that they're interacting with and working with and going into the building with and sharing a break room with are not following the guidelines. And so, listen, this is something that we always preach. And for as long as I've been advising staffing companies, I've always preached talking to your clients, partnering with your clients, trying to educate your clients into how important this stuff is to protect not only your employees, but to protect their own employees. And so most companies are willing to listen to those kinds of conversations, but it's really a partnering with your clients to make sure that their policies are, as Tim said earlier, at least as good as yours, and so that you're not putting your employees in harm's way by placing them on a temporary or permanent basis into an environment where guidelines won't be followed. Also, you've got to talk about data security with your clients to make sure that, whose computer is being used, are there VPNs involved, is your data and your employees' personal computer systems or the computer's devices that they're using, that's the word I was looking for, the devices that they're using are sufficiently protected when they log on to the company's website or network, because these days there are significantly more data breaches that we're seeing in all kinds of different forms, whether it's phishing or just straight out hacking. And so you want to make sure that you partner with your staffing clients to make sure that their data security, as Tim suggested, at least as good as yours is. Also, I think you need to start the discussion with your staffing company clients about whether work can and should be performed remotely. I bet you your contracts now with your staffing clients don't necessarily address whether the work can be performed remotely or should be performed remotely. And your culture as a staffing company may be slightly different than the culture of your clients, and they want someone in the office, even though you internally have a policy where if the work can get done remotely, let's get it done remotely and eliminate, or I shouldn't say eliminate, reduce the risk.
And so, if I might interject real quick, Dave,
sure.
You make a really, really good point. One of the things I'm seeing anecdotally a lot is looking at your contract with your customers. Who has the obligation to provide the safe workspace? How is this risk being handled? How are the obligations being shared? And to be honest, these contracts, a lot of them didn't anticipate what Dave just said. It's like, this is new territory. So I do a lot on a daily basis of going through, not just communicating between staffing companies and their customers about the contractual obligations and whether they apply and whether they need to be changed, and how the obligations are shared and how the risk is mitigated between the parties. So that's a really good point that Dave raises, that wasn't anticipated. And if it is, some of the contracts say you're going to, client's going to supply an OSHA compliant workspace. Well, we knew what that was when it was a manufacturing facility pre-COVID. Now, what is an OSHA compliant workspace?
And good point is that, you know, if you're staffing white collar, those OSHA considerations are very often just ignored, right? It's not like you're driving a forklift or running heavy machinery, but now those guidelines really implicate the white collar workspace as well. So you need to think about that.
Yeah, I feel like every contract, like none of them were prepared for a global pandemic, or if they were, like, let us know who your lawyer is, because I think that would be pretty amazing. We just got a question in, and probably the question that everyone is dreading thinking about, and just it's just not something that we want to consider. But what would happen when people go back to the office and someone in the office does get sick? What does that mean, and how could companies manage that?
Yeah, that's a tricky question, right? If I'll take it from two different prongs. If you manage to keep the person out of the workplace because they have symptoms, if they call up and say they have symptoms, you need to really sort of investigate when the last time they were in the workplace, who became who was within close contact, because remember, the CDC guidelines refer a lot to close contact. So just because someone might have been infected in your workspace doesn't automatically disqualify your whole workspace as having people in it. So I think if someone becomes sick in the office, but they weren't symptomatic in the office, then I think it's a different response than if they were symptomatic in the office. I think in either case, you have to make sure that that person stays out for the quarantine period, right? Or until they get the proper test to make sure that they don't have COVID, or whether they do. And certainly this is something that we've all experienced in the Northeast, but in the Southeast and Southwest, as the cases begin to grow, people haven't had any experience with that. So also, I think that people in those areas might want to talk to other staffing companies up in the Northeast to see how they handled it when people did get sick in the workplace. I think also you have to make sure that you advise those other employees that might have come in close contact and maybe have them get a test. Not sure you want to send them home. I think it depends on how close the contact was and how symptomatic the individual was. I read an article about a healthcare worker who went to a bar for the first time in 3 months, and the next week, 15 of the people at the bar were infected. So that can certainly have a huge consideration on how you do that. So when people become sick in the office, I think what you can do is ramp up your testing, ramp up your enforcement of your masks, maybe send some people home and work remotely for a short period of time, just until you have a chance to, and this is another thing you'll need to do, disinfect, right? Certainly, I think it's important to disinfect, even if you just have people coming into the office for a visit and don't know that they're infected or sick, right? But certainly, if you have one of your employees get infected, then you want to make sure you shut down him for a day, or overnight do a full disinfection of the office. So if that happens, I think you have to just ramp up your enforcement and your considerations of what happens, and keep that person out of the workspace, and keep the people out of the workspace who had close contact with them, Catriona.
Yeah, and then we got a question just following up from that, which is probably a very valid concern as well. Is there a chance then that an employee could sue an employer if they believe that they contracted the virus at work?
You know, that's an open question. I think the answer is probably. And I think the best protection against that is to have these strong policies, so that you can demonstrate, both in terms of policy and in terms of practice, that you followed the best guidance that was out there. And that's probably the EEOC and the CDC and OSHA, as we talked about from the beginning. So if in fact you are following those guidelines, the employer's defense is going to be, what else could I have done, right? And when people violated, I disciplined, I trained, I educated, I communicated my policies, and I didn't just let the pandemic run our workplace. I conformed the workplace to the new normal, the new realities of the pandemic.
Right, and I think on top of that, you look at the EEOC guidance on whether you have to report an illness in the workplace, and it's not altogether clear where they got the illness. That's the inherent problem involved. Is like, how far do you go into the sick worker's background and say, did you go to a bar last night? Did you get it here? Do I have an obligation to report under the EEOC guidelines? Also, anecdotally, Dave and I have seen with some clients where this is already starting in a similar situation, discharging an employee that says they're at risk, and you put them into an environment now where they may get COVID. And they're looking at that as a basis for challenging the discharge from the employment. So it's already starting.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think one thing that we've really been speaking with clients about is documenting everything. So if you implement this policy, document the efforts that you went to enforce it and everything that you did. So as David said, that you can present the steps that you've taken to prevent this. And one thing you mentioned, Tim, was obviously employees that are at risk. So there is probably a difference between high-risk employees. So how would you manage high-risk employees, and what sort of are the guidelines around that? Can they be treated differently? What if they don't want to go back to the workplace?
It's a difficult question, and I know that it especially for older employees and for pregnant employees, returning to the workplace is very daunting. The concept of returning to the workplace is very daunting. So the EEOC actually has some guidance out there that relates specifically to this issue. And the way we sort of analyze it is that whereas just necessarily getting sick with COVID doesn't implicate the Americans with Disabilities Act or the ADA requirements, and allows you to potentially gather more information than you might otherwise be able to do about a person's health situation. If they have a documented or demonstrated high-risk situation, then the ADA does get implicated, according to the EEOC, and you have to consider entering into the interactive process with that person and reaching an accommodation. And so the EEOC guidance, and I know we're sort of running a little short on time, but you can take a look at the EEOC guidance, because it's a little different, slightly different for when someone actually asks for an accommodation. So someone comes to the HR office and says, I'm at risk and I'm uncomfortable with going back. They've asked for an accommodation, and you have to work on that process in order to be able to accommodate. Even though where you know someone to be high risk, you may need to make an accommodation even if one isn't requested. And I think that if you have employees over 65, because remember that the death rate or the percentage of deaths from COVID were somewhere around 80% were above the age of 65. So, it really is a high risk category, and certainly pregnant women too. I don't think the numbers are that bad statistically for pregnant women, but certainly not something, there's additional considerations there. So even if you know that they're in that category and they don't ask for an accommodation, there may still need to be steps taken to protect them. And things that the EEOC says that you might be able to do to accommodate a high-risk individual is to provide enhanced personal protective equipment. So those people might actually walk around with face shields and with gowns and things. As crazy as that sounds, in a non-medical environment, that may be one of the accommodated measures that you take. You can also increase physical barriers, increase spacing, make sure that those people are isolated. But the question there becomes, well, then why not just isolate them at home? Why not have them at home rather than bring them into the workplace? Eliminate their marginal job functions, right? So you may need to adjust certain of their functions that interact them with other people, right? So if there are ways to adjust their job functions to take them out of harm's way, you might need to do that. And also, the EEOC says maybe modify their work schedules and have them come in when other workers are not in the workplace. And so those are just some examples of accommodations that may be made for high-risk individuals.
Perfect. One question I do really want to touch on, and I know we're coming up to the end of the time, is around sick leave and family leave. when a worker returns to the office, are they still eligible for this, and how does that apply?
Yeah, the sick leave that came out when when the pandemic first hit, sick leave was something that everybody paid attention to, but now it's alive and well, right? And so certainly in those areas that the pandemic hasn't hit as much as soon, the sick leave is going to be an issue for those employers that may never have had to deal with. So the sick leave works, and we've had entire webinars on sick leave alone. So I'll try to hit the highlights, but there's a lot to consider. But essentially, to the extent that people can't telework, they are entitled to paid sick leave in a variety of categories, but one is if they're subject to quarantine or isolation under a government order, whether they're advised by a healthcare provider to quarantine, whether they're showing symptoms. And again, this is the issue of whether, you know, how far does the symptoms go? In other words, right now, or at the beginning of the pandemic, we were very accepting of a person with a cough immediately being removed from the workplace. But now, where does that line get drawn? Where are the concerns that but if they're symptomatic and they're seeking medical advice, they will be eligible for paid sick leave under the federal law. And so also there's sort of a catch-all is if the government dictates any other type of person that may need to be out of the workplace. So they'll get full pay for a week, for 2 weeks, for 2 full weeks, for 80 hours. The calculation for full-time employees is pretty easy. The calculation for part-time employees actually looks back over a 6-month period, over what they made on a daily basis over a 6-month period, and you'll pay them for 14 days what they made on a daily basis over a 6-month period. So the calculations are based on the last 6 months and what their pay is. Documentation is important here. So when someone asks for sick leave, you can ask for things like the name of the government agency issuing the order to quarantine, or more likely, the name of the doctor that has directed that person to remain at home and quarantine or isolate because of COVID. So you don't necessarily have to take their word for it, so to speak. You can ask and should ask for certain documentation and a written statement as to the reason and which qualifying reason for sick leave that they're requesting the sick leave. So you can sort of drill down into the reasons and into the basis for someone to ask for sick leave. And if they do take a test, because arguably without already getting directed by a medical professional, they have to be both symptomatic and seeking medical attention. You can follow up as to whether they sought that medical attention and what the results were. So you can sort of try to keep employees honest when it comes to that. And that's changing too, because I think at the beginning, everyone was just sort of willing, if people wanted to stay at the office for 14 days, it wasn't going to cost anything. And, so the government was going to pay for it. And so you might as well just let them stay out of the office. But, if that's changing and sensibilities are changing, you can certainly ask for backup information. And then also, it's not only paid sick leave, but it's paid family leave, paid at 2/3 up to a cap for employees whose kids are home from school. Now, what's interesting is when that was enacted in April, it was for 10 or 12 weeks was designed to cover the 10 or 12 week period that kids would be in school until May and June came and schools started to close. Now, I don't know what's going to happen. When people have no childcare for the summer because camps are not opening and things like daycares are just barely opening. So the question becomes, if schools aren't open, then how is childcare going to get accomplished and whether that's implicated here? And I think we'll need some guidance coming out on that in the near future now that, especially in the Northeast, schools have closed. And I think in the Southeast, schools have been closed for a month. So what's going to happen in the summer? And then again, what's going to happen when and if schools don't open in the fall? We don't know yet. I think the hope is that schools will open in the fall. but we're not 100% sure that they will and to what capacity. So this is going to be a changing area in terms of those things as well, both the entitlement to sick leave, paid sick leave for COVID, and also for expanded family and medical leave related to COVID.
Yeah. Perfect. And then we have a question in that I'd love to answer. It's specific, well, it's not really specific, but this organization is based in New York and are just asking, what would they do if their employee doesn't want to use public transport to come to work? So, and I'm sure that applies to a lot of cities where people are expected to commute via public transport.
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that's a difficult political question to answer, because I think what's happening is that politically, state and local authorities are saying that they're taking precautions to make public transport safe. So I think the same analysis might be used there for high-risk individuals versus non-high-risk individuals. I think that if they're non-high risk, you might not need to make accommodations, although you may want to offer other types of transportation, offer some reimbursement for Uber, but that could get expensive. So for non-high risk, I think you could probably still say, listen, you need to get to work. I don't know what to tell you. For high risk, that may be part of the accommodation of requiring them to come back to work. Because if the only way they can come back to work is on transport, or public transportation, and that puts them at higher risk, although I don't think it's real clear whether it does or not. I think everybody thinks it might, but I don't think that there's any finding as to that. I think that for high risk individuals, you may in fact, as part of the accommodation, have to figure out another way to get them to work.
Right, and if I might, this is pre-COVID, but I can see this coming back up, and I hear from some clients. The staffing company wants to provide transportation for their employees to get to the job site. Usually in the manufacturing side, they don't want the recs to go unfilled. They don't want no-shows. So they talk about, well, we'll rent a van to drive people to the work site. And that raises all kinds of liability issues, obviously. And now you overlay that with COVID as well. It just is another whole analysis to make on the risk that you're taking as a staffing company by doing that, and have to balance that against no-shows in the workplace. That was already an issue pre-COVID, and now is certainly an issue post. So using public transportation, providing transportation, just getting people to the job site is always been an issue, and it's going to be an ongoing one. It's more complicated to Dave's point.
Yeah, and I think as well as that, like, also outside of just public transportation, what happens if a worker just refuses to come back to the work site? Like, what are their employers' rights there? Well,
it's also a moving target, right? Because it used to be, especially in the unemployment context, if work was open and you were offered the job to come back to work, you had to come back to work, or you could be terminated. Here, you have considerations of high-risk people. You have considerations of people who want to be on unemployment and like being on unemployment, because I think the number is around $75,000 a year. If you're making less than $75,000 a year, you're actually making more through July 15th than you by not working than if you are working. So I think the only consideration that you can do, and really the states now are essentially saying, if you feel uncomfortable about coming back to work because of COVID, now I think that's the word they used, uncomfortable, you can respond to the state agency that you have not been offered work, even though you have. So if you've been offered work, but you're uncomfortable about going back, you're allowed to answer on your unemployment application that you've not been offered work because the work isn't suitable for you because you're concerned about COVID. And so for now, if people don't want to come back to work, I think the only concern, the only real remedy employers have is to hire somebody else. The one area here of people who don't qualify under the family leave law and who don't request family leave, if they just refuse to come back to work, I think, then you don't have to pay them. You can terminate them, and you don't have to preserve their jobs. And you can go out and hire someone else. And I know that's difficult, but I think that's the best answer.
And to Dave's point, I think there are political overtones and social overtones, but in a lot of ways, it's not different than the workplace was before. If you were going to place a temp in a warehouse and you're like, I don't like being there because it doesn't feel safe, well, then you don't place them there. You don't have to put them there. So, you know, maybe at some point we'll get back to an equilibrium where it's really not much different than pre-COVID. That the way we address it is going to be similar, but right now that's not where we are. There's a lot of different things that are at play socially and politically, and we'll see how that plays out.
Perfect. Well, we are at time, so I think we will end the webinar there. I just want to say a massive thank you, Tim and Dave. That was incredible, very insightful, and I think addressed a lot of concerns that people will have around returning to the workplace, and also gave some really good practical advice on preparing the workplace and considerations for that.